So as well as Anupam, Professors Anupam, Chander and Nick Suzor, who you've already heard about, we've now introduced to our panel two new speakers who come from slightly different perspectives. First of all, we have, I'll start there, Ellen Broad, who is a senior fellow at the 3A Institute at the Australian National University. Many people will be familiar with Ellen, not if only because she used to have my job. So those of you who've come previously will know her from her tenure as the Executive Officer of the Australian Digital Alliance. But moving on from there, she's done a lot of work in data and artificial intelligence and regulation of data and openness of data. So she is trying to pick the interesting bits to pick out of her CV. She worked previously as the head of technical delivery for the Consumer Data Standards Program at CSIRO's Data 61, and also for as the head of policy for the Open Data Institute. Many of you will, of course, know her from her book, which was published in the last year or so. When was it published? I don't know. 2018. I thought it was actually a little bit longer ago than that. 2018, which is of course called Humans, the AI Condition, and which has made quite a bit of a splash, I think, both as, you know, a crossover between kind of academic, thoughtful work and public success and public interest. So you've probably seen her speaking around on those kind of issues. But so she'll be giving us the perspective kind of the futurist, I suppose, a person who thinks about issues concerned with data and AI and moving things towards the future. And then we also have Sunita Bose. She might be slightly less well known to people because she is actually quite new to our kind of community here. Sunita is the new managing director, well, not that new, a year in. It feels new to me. Managing Director of DIGI, the Digital Interest Group Incorporated, which is a non-profit industry association which advocates for the interests of the digital industry in Australia. And DIGI is a relatively new organisation. It's been around 4 years or so. To try to create a platform for discussion of these kinds of issues around regulation of digital industries and how Australia can get it right and also interact with the global regulations that are going on. So Sunita's background was for many years as head of policy for change.org, the online petition platform that I'm sure a lot of you will know. And in that she's had a lot of experience looking at exactly the kind of issues Nick in particular raised about public versus private regulation. How do you do service, terms of service and policies, as well as how, what kind of regulation goes on. So she's got a very interesting perspective, coming both from our tech sector but also more broadly. So I'm going to invite our two new speakers to kind of start us off. I think I'll start with Ellen. I think I almost gave her a little bit more warning than Sunita.
Probably 30 minutes warning or something like that.
I was going to say, starting with the idea of the question that we actually have in the program, for those of you who noticed it, which is how do we make data regulation work now and into the future?
Sure. So I thought, leading off from that question, I'd pick up on 2 points that Nick made during his keynote that have had me thinking about what the future of data regulation looks like. And the first was you brought up context quite a lot, that context makes navigating issues of what is and isn't hateful or offensive difficult. And this applies to data regulation as well. I'm seeing it more and more. We historically still think about regulating data as either regulating the act of transmission or regulating the process by which it was transmitted, but still treating the kind of data itself as stable and homogeneous, when, we are in a porous world now where ultimately the harm that people are concerned about and the reason we keep talking with increasing unease about data sharing and data use is not so much because, did I consent or did I not consent? That is always a concern, but that even irrespective of the mode of transmission or the mechanism by which consent was granted, is the context within which that particular data is going to be used. So someone flippantly said on a panel with me last week, we were talking about data transmission and data sharing across geographical boundaries, and they said, you know, $1 is still $1 in Australia, whether or not you're accessing that dollar in London. Like, it still has an innate value. And unlike money, a data point like pregnancy status technically is the same bit of information in any context, but the potential harm that that causes is context specific. And so how do you rethink data regulation, not to focus on the mechanism of transmission or the mode of transmission in deciding what is lawful or unlawful, but in terms of the potential harm from the use of that information? I might have granted consent without realising the context within which a data point like pregnancy status might be used in ways that will actually, in effect, be harmful to me further down the track. So I'm wondering how we bring context, how we pivot away from potentially mode of transmission and mechanism by which consent is granted or not granted into thinking more about context. Unfortunately, that's not fun for legislators, because the more nuanced and context-specific you want to make your reasoning, the more principles-based and high-level usually your legislation has to be, because you can't account for all contexts. So that was my one point, is like we have this issue at the moment that it's very hard to actually prevent harm from occurring by focusing on mode of transmission. And then the second point that I was going to make was about scale and failure, because something that I was thinking about in a lot of the challenges that we're grappling with at the moment in content moderation, in takedowns, is that we're ultimately grappling with issues of scale. The kind of values on which our infrastructure is built prioritises speed, scale, and reach above all else. So even when we talk about forms of moderation, we're talking about still trying to facilitate forms of moderation that are tackling those problems at speed, at scale, as though those are immutable and will never be changed. And I just want to challenge that a little bit, not so much because I think we should go back to, not easily transmitting information over the web, but it always frustrates me that we accept scale, speed, and reach as kind of given and unchanging, when we know historically that it is possible to walk back from certain implementations of a technology. Consequences are great, but I just would like us to remind ourselves that speed, scale, and efficiency are not innate and given. They are values that we accept as part of the cost of doing business online, which maybe then brings me to that point about failure, which is, okay, well, to the extent that you say, well, we are always dealing with speed, scale, and transmission at the moment, actually certain issues like the potential for human rights abuses on your platforms become failures that you can anticipate, not, as Nick said, the specific nature of the abuse, but that speed, scale, and reach are going to be the driving factors by which failure might take place. So how do you address that as platform operators? One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is that even though we talk a lot about software engineering and engineering culture, the culture that we have as software engineering, as software engineers, is actually quite different from other more long-standing engineering cultures. We do not see failures as to be avoided because there are consequences. We describe failures as bugs to be fixed. So we do not go out of our way to avoid failure. We try to learn from failure, because for us as the designers, it doesn't have immediate consequences. And I wonder how we change that.
There's so many things to unpack in that. I'm thinking particularly about the context, as you said, like that issue of learning from failure. It becomes so much more unpalatable when the failure is something like Christchurch. And that's been the challenge, and that's why you saw the knee-jerk reaction of the kind of regulation that I think it was Nick mentioned, the Christchurch one, where the regulation is brought in with no consultation, and it is extremely broad, and it doesn't have particular safeguards, and it attacks individuals because there's this feeling, very visceral feeling of wanting to make people suffer. But I do feel like we have learnt from it. The sector has. And I'll turn to Sunita and not keep talking myself to say, for you to kind of follow on from there about how do we create, answering the same questions, how do we create regulations into the future, and perhaps maybe thinking or reflecting a little bit on the concept of failure and how the sector and groups that you've worked with have responded to some of the controversial and difficult moments over the last few years.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to share my views. I did actually think more about where copyright fits in rather than data, but data opens a whole new can of worms.
I had a copyright segue too there, and I deliberately went away, so I'll do it after.
But I suppose, actually, just to take a step back, so I run the Digital Industry Group, and DIGI for short, and its mission is really around advocating for a thriving Australian digitally enabled economy, one where online safety and privacy are really protected, and we're really working hard to mitigate potential harms, but also where Australia is a market where we have a growing selection of digital products and services, and in that vision there is a delicate balance. Late last year, and I don't want to just dive into the economics of it all and appear insensitive to some of the broader social issues, which I'll come back to, but on the economics of it is something I wanted to it's something I've been thinking about a lot in this role in the year that I've been here. Late last year, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison actually announced that he'd like Australia to be a fully digitally enabled economy by 2030. And now that we have, I suppose, less than a decade to that deadline, it does kind of force you to think about, all right, well, what's the pathway to that? And where does an issue like copyright fit in? And where do the other issues that we're talking about also sort of fit in, as we're working really hard to mitigate the harms while also kind of keeping this ambitious goal in mind? Because for me, that goal is, Australia does really well with technology adoption, but we also have to think about how do we make this a country where, large global companies want to grow, where we have homegrown startups, and so there is a balance there. And I think, Nick, you did a great job earlier of sort of talking about some of the kind of the regulations that are coming and sort of how we think about that balance, and certainly something I think a lot about. On that, when we sort of think about the digitally enabled economy, it's more than just the tech sector, and it's more than just sort of talking about software engineers. DIGI commissioned some research last year called Australia's Digital Opportunity, which I encourage you to check out. It's on our website. And this is an interesting piece of research because for the first time we looked at not just the economic contribution of the ICT sector, which has been quantified before, but also which is about $69 billion to GDP, but also the impacts across all these other sectors, be they, mining or, a whole across the economy, and found that it's actually $122 billion a year. But interestingly, our ICT sector has been in steady decline in terms of its proportion of economic output for the last 25 years, and somewhat shockingly, Australia's tech sector is the second smallest out of the OECD, second only to Mexico. So this report also looked at, okay, well, what are some of the countries that are leading in this sector doing, and what are the things that we can emulate? And it identified, a couple of 6 different areas, and things like skills and talent and other issues that are probably, there's too much to go through there on that now, but because I wanted to bring us back to copyright, one of the areas that I identified was the need for sort of consistent global regulation, and I think copyright is one of those areas where we're at potential risk of, we've got to look at where our copyright regime fits in globally. And so globally there's this standard around expeditious removal. And I was actually just reflecting on the question earlier about sort of conflicting rights, and I think expeditious, and sort of to take a step back away from this sort of economics, which I've been dwelling on, but also the theme of the conference today, which is about public interest. The way that I think about an issue like copyright really kind of comes back to these questions of public interest, and is shaped by my time at change.org, where it was my job to sort of assess a wide range of takedown requests, and remembering this is a platform where anybody can go, they can start a petition on any issue that they care about. You see the most inspiring public interest calls for changes at a local, global, national level, people who are, wouldn't otherwise have this sort of vehicle to create changes of this magnitude. Yet at the same time, you see matching levels of creativity in the kind of companies that want to take things down where they feel like they're being unfairly criticised, and even copyright. Normally it would be defamation or, claims of misinformation, but copyright would often also be used as a rationale for taking things down. And so I'm wary of kind of proposals for reform in this area that really kind of incentivise that quick, takedown, and without, the platforms themselves doing that due diligence, because I think there's kind of a question of conflicting rights there, and we need to sort of look really carefully at that. And I think some of the kind of principles and global approaches really, really kind of show that. So anyway, I know that copyright is not necessarily the most sensitive of the issues, but I think it's one of those ones where even then you sort of see this tension and the pressure of getting the decision making right, because in those instances where you do face pressure and there is sort of liability questions, if you don't get it right, you are really sort of silencing speech, and there is a public interest. There's a public interest at stake.
Well, I think you're right that copyright actually does play a very interesting role in this space, in that it is both one of the more controllable ones. Definitely Nick, and I think Anupam also mentioned the ability to thumbprint. Hashing is the new word. Those of us who are old-fashioned will think of thumbprint copyright materials. It is more easy generally to identify copyright infringement in the online environment than hate speech. Let's put it that way. There's still, people work very hard to work around it, of course, and bad actors really put a lot of effort into that. But in terms of AI and technical fixes, we're a lot further down that track on copyright. So it's one that's more easily controlled, and it's also normally a bit less controversial in terms of it's not hate speech. It's not. It doesn't bang up against free speech as much. If it's somebody else has created and you've put up without their permission, it's a nice simple sort of equation. In theory, until it becomes a tool for affecting all these other areas, which is, of course, the whole theme today. And this is exactly what you're saying. You get a copyright takedown notice, and is that actually being used for a copyright purpose or something else? It's being used because it is the easy in, the wedge. So I will open that to the whole panel to reflect maybe now. Anupam, or who would like to say something next? You look excited.
Sure. So I want to begin, though, by returning to an observation by Ellen, which was really important. So about data regulation generally, and the pregnancy example is really a fascinating one. So you can imagine lots of ways that companies might get to know that you're pregnant. And so, you might buy particular clothes that are designed for pregnancy, et cetera. And in all that context, you can also imagine the abuse of that data somewhere down the line. You can imagine the transfer of that information to employers who might have different views about employees who are pregnant, or you might imagine transferring that information to insurance companies, which might take different views, et cetera, about the riskiness of various things. And so that also suggests that the array of companies and the array of manipulation and exploitation actually could include, small companies that are offering pregnancy clothes, or an app that is offering tracking of your, so that to help you get pregnant, et cetera. So there's just the number of players that need to be regulated in this space is really quite large, and so this is one of my concerns in the context of thinking about everything in the terms of we need to regulate platforms, is that often that leads us to we need to regulate 5 companies, and that's just that misses a lot of the kind of possible avenues of mischief in the process. Now I recognize we need to regulate the large platforms, et cetera, but I just want to make sure that when we're thinking about these things, and I think that was implicit in what everyone's said thus far, we need to think about all the ways that information is being gathered and processed, and the ways that it can be abused along the way.
I've spoken enough. I want to hear from you. Others here.
How about copyright as a thin edge of the wedge, or convergence of platforms?
So when I was preparing for this panel, I was conscious of the fact that I haven't actually talked about copyright for 8 years, because that's how siloed the different communities are. So I was the executive officer for the Australian Digital Alliance between 2011 and 2013, and then I moved into data communities and then into machine learning and artificial intelligence communities, and I have never had a conversation about copyright in those communities. But I think it's because you typically, when you are using and processing information, you are not the same person who is concerned with the provenance of information. And the way in which provenance is recorded, and provenance is important in lots of ways in terms of misuse, exploitation, copyright ownership, but the way that our infrastructure is designed is that provenance is stripped away from the material that you use in processing, or it is very hard to navigate to. So I guess that's just an observation that I've got, is that quite often copyright in your material as a user of that material in a data processing capacity, whether that's statistics, machine learning, whatever, is typically something that you cannot even trace back. People sneak it in there so they know whether it's copyright infringing. So like a common practice is to put some fake, for example, like heavily commercially licensed data sets. Typically the way that you determine if there is misuse of that data set in that it is copyright infringing is that you slip some fake content into it. So then if someone is using an addressing database that has your fake addresses, you know that they are using it in breach of the terms and conditions associated with your data set. But you wouldn't know that necessarily. The purpose is to hide it from you.
There's a fun example of that with the lyrics. I can't even remember the lyrics site. It's lyrics.com or something. It's I don't know. A Genius, that's it, who are suing Google because they did exactly that, but what they did is they snuck in, they used, first of all, commas, straight versus curved commas, and it spelt out it in. They slipped into the lyrics they had online to see if they were appearing in Google searches, and it spelt out red-handed in Morse code if it was in there, and they found it in a lot of places. Nick?
So what concerns me about some of the policy debates we're having is that we're not really learning the lessons from copyright. So for a long time, these debates have proceeded in isolation, but copyright's probably the most extensive and well-developed area of internet regulation, right? It's from Napster onwards in the late 90s, a well-funded copyright lobby has been trying to figure out ways to control and require intermediaries to control the flow of information. And so they've gone through a number of different strategies to achieve that. So some of which I spoke, you can sue users, you can try a notice and takedown regime, you can try to develop commercial partnerships, you can so on. So I think what's difficult now is that we don't seem to be building on those lessons in as structured way as we could, right? So the laws for intermediary liability across different areas of law, defamation, hate speech, other areas where intermediaries are liable, they're crazy. They don't make sense in a lot of cases. They're conflicting. There's different standards of knowledge, different standards of proof, different burdens of proof, different defenses, different appeal mechanisms. It creates a great big mess of conflicting standards. I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn from what works well in one area and apply that in other areas. So I think the conversation we should be having, let's think about the notice and takedown regime under copyright, which, has flaws. And for a long time, we've been talking about the balance involved. It's not just between intermediaries and rights holders, but it is also fundamentally about the freedom of speech and freedom of access to information. So there's that triangle of interests. And we've been working through and rehearsing these debates for over 20 years, as Professor Chander points out. So we kind of know the circumstances in which a private notice and takedown regime works well, or a predominantly private notice and takedown regime works well. We also know the circumstances where it's likely to fail, and we know, for example, that there are existing problems with the red flag rule, for example, where people become aware of material. And there are problems with spurious notices, that there's not enough disincentives to send fake notices, and there's not enough you can do when you think that someone is sending a fake notice. We know that there's problems with counter notice system, that almost no one ever uses the counter notice system because it's scary, right? The language you tell users is, if you file a counter notice, you're probably going to get sued. And so we know that there are flaws, but we know on the whole, notice and takedown is a pretty good way of dealing very rapidly with a large volume of infringing content. So I think we should be using those insights when we start talking about, say, how do you regulate defamation? Currently, in Australia, defamation law, there's no safe harbour that applies. And that means that when a service provider gets a bare allegation that something is defamatory, they either have to back themselves and say, no, we think this is spurious, or a rational provider will say, I have no way of telling the truth of this claim. I think it might be true, but I'm not willing to stick my neck out, and we're going to remove it.
I can say, without naming companies, I can certainly say that there are companies that have said to me, yes, in Australia, with no safe harbour, we just take things down. Full stop, no questions asked.
So I think we can learn from that. And Sunita, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, I was just going to echo a lot of that and just and bring in the point that you raised earlier, Anupam, around, the focus on regulating for a few companies, and often they're the companies that have the largest resources to tackle these sorts of problems, and so potentially also can kind of assume some more legal risk than others. And I think, bringing it back to this broader goal, if we see the potential of growing this sector and the economic benefit it can realise across the country, then we need to think a little bit bigger, because, a singular focus on, particular companies won't necessarily give us that bigger picture view of, okay, like if we have a thriving digitally enabled economy, then we're going to have a wide range of digital products and services that enable the upload of content, be they customer reviews or comments. And so, we have to think really big with things like copyright reform, with the national defamation reform that's also underway, about how we create processes that are fair, to use the example of defamation, yes, there are people who actually have their, reputation seriously maligned on the internet, and they need avenues for recourse. Then there are also kind of examples of the not legitimate claims, and we also need to provide legal certainty for a wide range of companies with a wide range of resources when they're faced with a claim like that, where they don't just take this is too hard, especially with smaller companies. And, I've been in this position, in a smaller company where, you could unless you have crystallised the values that you have when you face that, or come up with policies, where you could just say, I don't want to deal with this. Or you might not even have a company with a policy person or a legal team to manage it. We need to create legal certainty for platforms in those moments, and fair processes for all involved. And that requires a lot of thoughtfulness.
And Nick's point about consistency seems relevant here too, particularly when you're talking about companies operating in multiple markets and all that kind of thing. Consistency becomes an essential part of that ability to actually implement as well. You look like you have something to say, Anupam?
Sure. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the observations in the last couple of comments with respect to notice and takedown in the context of defamation. So the problem here, you're familiar in copyright that a rights holder sends a notice to the company that is hosting the allegedly infringing material. The company responds typically by considering and seeing that it looks like a valid claim, and then it proceeds to take it down unless there's a counter notice, et cetera. In the United States, at least, that notice that has to be provided, it has to be provided under penalty of perjury. So you have to, claim that you really do have serious copyright ownership, and so there's a risk if there's a criminal risk, in fact, if you're making false claims along the way. So that is a slight limit on the notice itself. But I want to just imagine this in the defamation context, because I'm not sure there's any defamation defendant that's ever said, I didn't defame, nor is there someone who has been accused of something which is often true who said, no, I actually did that. And so, in other words, this is a world in which people who are accused of even factual things often insist that those factual claims against them are false. And this is, especially visible in the context of Me Too, which was largely carried and via Twitter and other social media platforms. And essentially, what that meant was that people would say, X person did this to me, and so they would identify that person very often, and they would make very serious allegation against that person. And so imagine that in the context of Harvey Weinstein, whom we know is a very litigious person, and so Harvey Weinstein thankfully has been convicted now of some of these offenses, but if Twitter had faced a notice and takedown system in the United States, it would have taken it down immediately. Why? Because Harvey Weinstein would have sent a notice saying these allegations are false. This was all consensual. That's his consistent claim in all of this, and so they would have immediately responded by taking it down. So a notice and takedown system in the defamation context makes it very easy for bad actors to exploit that system to avoid bad things being said about them.
If I can just follow up, I agree absolutely with what you said, except the situation in Australia is worse than that in the United States, because not only we don't have a notice and takedown system, but we have defamation that is hard to rebut. So it's unlimited liability on the part of the service provider. So unless Twitter in this case were willing to stand up and defend an action, it would also have taken things down without a notice and takedown system. So I think what we're talking about here is the procedure for resolving disputes. Without strong immunity, then we've got to figure out who's the most appropriate body to hear these cases. And for something tough like defamation, where there's hard questions of fact at hand, the only real answer is a court that has fact-finding powers, and that makes it really difficult. You can't have. It's extremely difficult for a private company to make a factual determination, and we shouldn't be asking them to.
So I totally want to now move on to asking about the new private court that Facebook set up and a whole lot of things, but I am conscious of the fact that we're totally late for lunch. So I'm going to help roll us up a little bit by asking you all to kind of, well, maybe not, only like a very, very quick 1 second type, each of you, reflection on the basic question of, like, if we were to regulate into the future, what would be your one thing that you would want us to really keep in mind as we're writing that regulation? Quick down the line.
You can read my book and I yield the balance of my time.
For free.
That is so unfair. I actually don't know. I guess the only observation that I'd make is we're talking a lot about consistency and standardisation and seamlessness, and I don't know about in copyright, but in broader issues of data regulation and artificial intelligence, we're actually seeing an increasing balkanisation of forms of regulation. So I just kind of like, is this a different world? Is everything going okay here? Or are we actually heading towards greater balkanisation and inconsistency?
Can we start learning from each other a bit more?
This is a very difficult question. Thank you, Jessica. I would just say that, like as I said at the beginning, it's a really delicate balance. So I don't think that, I can sort of blindly say, yep, this is the most important thing. But I will say that technology is moving at a fast pace, and I think there's a huge amount of knowledge and understanding within technology companies about how it's working. And we need to sort of make sure that the consultation is right so that that knowledge is actually sort of being heard by the decision makers, and so that we can kind of get that balance correct.
So that we actually know what technology can do and don't just assume.
Correct, yeah.
So I think that's exactly right, that we're living in an era of unprecedented technological change. The pace of the technologies that we had 20 years ago versus the technologies that we have today, and what we'll have 20 years from now is just incredibly remarkable. And I think we have to legislate for the future. So we have to legislate recognizing that we're writing the rules for the world of 2050, not the rules for the world of 1990. And so we need to think about the future and not just the past.
I'm tempted to make jokes about Australian copyright law being for the 1990s, but we'll move on from that. So thank you, all four of you. I am actually very sorry we didn't give you more time in the program. I think we could have talked about for a couple of hours between the four of you. But there's plenty of time for everybody in the audience to come up and talk to you at lunchtime. Yes, we didn't even get to audience questions, so thank you very much, everybody.